My name is Claire Donovan, and I'll never forget the Christmas night when my father stood at the head of the dining table, raised his glass, and announced in front of the entire family, "Claire, you will not receive a single cent of inheritance." For a moment, every fork froze in midair. Conversations died, the children stopped tapping on their phones, and the only sound left was the faint hum of holiday music drifting from the living room. My brothers leaned back in their chairs, their smug smiles barely concealed. My mother's hands tightened around her napkin. And me, I didn't flinch. I slid another bite of pie into my mouth, chewed slowly, and nodded as if he'd merely announced the weather forecast. Inside, my heart was steady, not because his words didn't sting, but because I had prepared for them my entire life. You see, I knew this moment was coming. My father, Richard Donovan, had always believed the family business belonged to my brothers. To him, I was the daughter who strayed too far, the one who refused to stay in Ohio and play the supporting role he had scripted for me. 7 years had passed since I last sat at that dining table. 7 years since I'd walked away from the suffocating expectations that told me my worth depended on following a path laid out by someone else. In those years, I had built a life he never asked about, a career he never cared to understand, and a strength he could never take away. And on that Christmas night, as his decree of disinheritance echoed across the room, I realized something profound. I didn't need what he was withholding. But here's the twist: the rest of my family didn't know what my father had just declared irrelevant was already dwarfed by what I had created in silence. While they assumed I was struggling with that little tech thing on the West Coast, Forbes had quietly published a list that very morning, a list my father clearly hadn't seen yet. This is where the story truly begins. A story not just about inheritance denied, but about self-worth claimed. About what happens when years of neglect, favoritism, and dismissal collide with a truth no one expected. Before I take you deeper into that night, the looks, the silences, the explosion that would soon unravel our family's hierarchy, I want to pause and say something to you watching this. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or written off, I need you to stay with me. This isn't just my story. It's a story about reclaiming the right to define yourself. And if that resonates, let me know where you're watching from and subscribe, because I promise what happens next is something you'll want to witness. The table that night wasn't just set with turkey and pie. It was set with decades of tension, my father's unwavering belief that only sons mattered in business, my mother's quiet complicity, and my own silent rebellion. And while he thought he was closing a chapter with his announcement, he had no idea he was igniting the beginning of an entirely new one. Because soon, very soon, someone else at that table would look down at their phone, gasp, and reveal the truth that would flip the entire narrative upside down. And that's where I'll take you next. When my father's words faded into silence, I looked around that long mahogany table and saw decades of family hierarchy frozen in place. My brothers Ryan and Daniel sat straight-backed, basking in the quiet validation of what had just been declared. My mother, Elaine, fiddled nervously with her wedding ring, eyes darting between us as if trying to soften a blow she had seen coming but hadn't stopped. And me? I folded my napkin neatly, the motion calm, almost surgical, even though every nerve in me remembered a lifetime of being told I didn't belong. Growing up, my father never disguised his favoritism. Ryan, the oldest, was praised for his sharp mind and business acumen. Daniel, the youngest, was celebrated for his charisma, his ability to make anyone like him. And me, the middle child, I was labeled the bright one, but in a way that always came with a caveat: bright, but impractical. When I'd sit at the dinner table and talk about algorithms or coding projects, my father would wave his hand dismissively. "That's not real business, Claire. Leave the heavy lifting to your brothers. You just focus on finding stability." It was never just words. It was the constant stream of reminders that my place was secondary. He took the boys to trade shows, introduced them to clients, groomed them for the company. I was told to set the table, to pour the wine, to look presentable when guests arrived. Even when I won math competitions or science fairs, the applause at home was muted compared to the thunder of pride he reserved for the boys. At first I tried harder. I thought if I could outachieve, he would have to see me. Straight A's, debate trophies, summer research programs. But each accolade was met with that same lukewarm nod, followed by some glowing comment about Ryan's leadership or Daniel's people skills. Slowly, I learned that his approval was not something I could win, it was something I was never meant to have. By the early 2000s, when my friends were being encouraged to dream without limits, my father still echoed a worldview decades behind. Business is a man's world, Claire. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be. My mother would catch my eye, then her lips pressing into a thin line. She never contradicted him, but in those silent glances, I saw her regret, the kind of regret that comes from swallowing your own voice for too many years. And so, as I sat at that Christmas dinner decades later, his words, "You will not receive inheritance," weren't new. They were the climax of a story that had been playing out since childhood. What stunned me wasn't the announcement itself, but the audacity of making it in front of everyone as if he wanted the humiliation to be complete, public, undeniable. But here's the thing, humiliation only works if you still crave validation, and I had stopped craving his approval years ago. That's what no one at that table understood yet. My father thought his declaration would crush me, strip me of standing, remind everyone that I was the outsider. He had no idea that outside his world, I had already built one of my own. Still in that moment, the sting of memory came back sharp, the years of being the afterthought, the child who was told her ideas were hobbies, not legacies. And it's important I share that with you, because maybe you felt it too. Maybe you've sat in a room where the people who should have lifted you only reminded you that you weren't enough. If you have, then you know the ache of realizing your family can sometimes be the first to underestimate you. And if you've been there, let me know in the comments. Share your story, because these conversations remind us we're not alone. And if you want more of these raw, real moments, don't forget to subscribe so you're here when the next chapter unfolds. That night, I glanced at my niece across the table, her eyes wide as she tried to understand what her grandfather had just said. And in her gaze, I recognized something familiar, the early seeds of doubt, the subtle message that girls should aim lower. That realization cut deeper than my father's words. It wasn't just about me anymore. His worldview was seeping into another generation, and I couldn't let that stand unchallenged. So I smiled faintly, not to dismiss the pain, but to signal something else: defiance, resilience. The story wasn't over. And though my father thought he had delivered the final verdict, he had no idea the next act was already in motion. Because secrets don't stay buried forever, and mine worth billions was about to surface in the most unexpected way. I still remember the day the letter from Stanford arrived. I had been pacing in my tiny bedroom, posters of code snippets and equations taped to the walls like talismans, when I tore open the envelope. Accepted. I read the word over and over, my hands shaking. My high school teacher had told me I had a gift, and now one of the best universities in the country agreed. That night, I carried the letter into my father's office. The heavy oak desk dominated the room, its surface lined with cigars, legal pads, and neat rows of contracts. He didn't even look up when I placed the acceptance in front of him. Finally, with a long sigh, he adjusted his glasses, skimmed it, and let out a derisive laugh. Stanford. In California. His voice dripped with disdain. That's ridiculous. The family business is here. Your brothers need to focus on business degrees so they can take over. That's where the money goes. Not this. He waved the letter like it was a flyer from a grocery store. Computer nonsense. I tried to explain about the program's prestige, about how technology was changing the world, about how this was my dream. He leaned back, puffed on his cigar, and dismissed me with one sentence: "Find a husband who can provide for you. This computer thing is just a hobby." My mother stood silently in the doorway. She didn't contradict him, didn't defend me. She just watched, her face pinched with guilt, while my father shredded the possibility of support. It was the first time I realized that in his eyes, no matter how much I achieved, I would always be less than my brothers. But I wasn't going to let his disbelief bury my future. The rejection from him hurt more than I admitted, but it also lit something in me, a stubborn flame that whispered, "If he won't believe in you, believe in yourself harder." So when the financial aid office told me I didn't get the critical scholarship I had hoped for, I didn't give up. I deferred admission for a year and threw myself into work. Morning shifts at a diner, afternoons folding clothes, and retail nights doing bookkeeping for small businesses. Sometimes I walked home past midnight, feet blistered, stomach growling, but with every paycheck I felt a step closer to California. I remember the exhaustion, collapsing onto my bed for 3 hours of sleep before doing it all again. My friends were going to football games on road trips, living the carefree youth I secretly longed for. I was living on caffeine spreadsheets and tips stuffed into apron pockets, but I never wavered. When I finally saved enough to enroll, I boarded that flight west with a suitcase, a secondhand laptop, and determination my father could never take away. I was terrified, yes. But underneath the fear was exhilaration. I was no longer waiting for permission. I was claiming my own future. At Stanford, the struggle didn't end. Rent was astronomical, textbooks cost more than my weekly wages, and there were nights I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But every late night in the computer lab, every bug I squashed in my code reminded me why I was there. I wasn't just learning, I was building the foundation of something bigger than anyone in that dining room back home could have imagined. And if you've ever felt that fire pursuing something that no one else believed in, carrying a dream no one else could see, then you know how lonely it can be. Tell me in the comments, what dream did people dismiss in you? What goal did they call impossible? Share it, because speaking it aloud is the first step to proving them wrong. Looking back, my father thought denying me tuition money would end my ambitions. What he didn't realize is that by refusing, he forced me to become unbreakable. The girl who walked into his office with trembling hands and a letter was no longer the same woman who sat at his Christmas table years later. And soon he and everyone else in that house would learn just how much stronger I had become. The year I deferred Stanford to work 3 jobs nearly broke me. Sunrise meant the clatter of dishes in a diner, coffee pots hissing while I balanced trays heavier than I was. Afternoons, I folded jeans and restocked shelves under fluorescent lights, my hands aching, my smile mechanical. At night, I huddled in a back office, punching numbers into ledgers for small businesses that could only afford part-time bookkeeping. Every shift blurred into the next, but I kept telling myself, one more paycheck, one more month. California is waiting. I lived on black coffee and day-old bagels, caught 3, maybe 4 hours of sleep, and counted pennies like they were diamonds. My friends were going to parties, to football games, talking about dorm life. I was calculating how many tips I needed to cover another textbook. And yet every time I thought about quitting, the image of my father shaking his head, calling computers a hobby, snapped me awake. His disbelief was fuel. Every dismissal, every smirk at the dinner table became another reason to prove him wrong. By the following fall, I stepped off a plane in California with a suitcase, a refurbished laptop, and a fire in my chest. Stanford wasn't glamorous for me, it was survival. While classmates explored clubs and study abroad programs, I hustled side jobs, tutoring math, fixing busted laptops, even designing websites for local restaurants. Finals week often meant 48 hours without sleep, fueled by vending machine snacks and determination. But all that struggle had purpose. Professors opened doors, classmates became collaborators, and in dingy labs at 2 a.m, I fell in love with the idea that code could change lives. It wasn't just about making programs work, it was about solving problems no one else could see. After graduation, I jumped into the tech world, not with glamour, but with grit. My first job at a tiny San Francisco startup paid just enough to share a cramped apartment with 3 roommates. But I soaked up everything: how to pitch to investors, how to pivot when code failed, how to build something from nothing. When that startup was acquired 2 years later, I finally had savings experience and the audacity to ask myself, why not start my own? That's when health tech AI was born. The idea was simple, but ambitious: use artificial intelligence to help doctors diagnose rare diseases. Everyone told me it was too risky, too complicated, too expensive. But I'd already been told too impossible my whole life. I wasn't about to stop now. Those early years nearly crushed me. Twice we were weeks away from shutting down. I maxed out credit cards, lived in a studio barely big enough for a bed, and poured every cent back into the company. But when our algorithm correctly identified a condition that had baffled specialists for months, hospitals started calling. One contract led to another. Slowly, the little project my father would have called a hobby turned into a company that was saving lives. It's funny when I think back to those diner shifts, the endless ledgers, the exhaustion of scraping by. I realize those were the crucibles that forged me. Without them, maybe I wouldn't have had the resilience to weather near bankruptcy, or the humility to lead a team through sleepless nights. My father's refusal had forced me to grow steel in my spine. And maybe you've been there too. Maybe you face that moment when the people who should support you instead tell you to give up. If you've ever worked yourself raw just to keep a dream alive, I want you to drop a comment. Tell me what kept you going when no one else believed. Because those stories matter, they remind us that persistence outlasts doubt. Years later, as I sat at that Christmas table, listening to my father strip me from the inheritance, I thought back to the girl who carried plates, folded clothes, and typed ledgers until her fingers cramped. She didn't know it then, but she was building more than tuition money. She was building proof that no decree, no dismissal, no inheritance denied could define her future. And soon my family would see the results of that proof in the most dramatic way possible. Graduation felt less like a ceremony and more like stepping onto a battlefield. I walked across that stage in my borrowed cap and gown diploma in hand, but the truth was the fight had only begun. My degree didn't guarantee comfort. It guaranteed more sleepless nights, more hunger, more pushing against walls no one else seemed to see. My first job was at a tiny startup in San Francisco. We worked out of a converted warehouse that smelled of old paint and burnt coffee, the kind of place where desks were mismatched. Code was written on whiteboards, and everyone was running on caffeine and desperation. The pay barely covered rent, but to me it was a golden ticket. For the first time, I wasn't reading about building companies, I was inside the messy, chaotic process of doing it. I learned more in 2 years at that startup than I had in 4 at Stanford. How to pitch when investors stared at you like you were wasting their time. How to pull an all-nighter fixing a bug because a demo was hours away. How to pivot when the perfect product didn't work. And how to lead people who believed in an idea even when you weren't sure it would survive the week. When that company was acquired, I wasn't rich, but I had savings. More importantly, I had knowledge. Enough to finally ask myself, what if I built something of my own? That's how health tech AI began. I was in my mid-20s with a laptop, a notebook full of sketches, and a stubborn conviction that technology could save lives. The idea was to build an AI system that could comb through millions of medical records, research papers, and patient histories to help doctors diagnose diseases they couldn't otherwise identify. It was ambitious, audacious even. Friends warned me it was too risky. Investors dismissed me. My own family never even knew it existed. But I couldn't shake the belief that this mattered. That if I could get it right, I could change medicine forever. So I worked like I had in those diner and retail days, around the clock, sacrificing sleep, comfort, and security. Every setback tested me. Twice we were weeks from shutting down. Once my team and I ate nothing but ramen for a month because payroll drained every account. Still, we pressed forward. And then finally we had a breakthrough. A case study where our algorithm diagnosed a rare condition doctors had missed. The hospital confirmed it. Families thanked us. It was validation not just of the technology, but of every sacrifice that had led there. The contracts started trickling in first local hospitals, then regional networks. What began as a fragile dream grew into a company with traction, momentum, and credibility. And I realized something profound. All those nights waiting tables, all those hours folding jeans, all the years of my father's rejection had built the muscles I needed. Resilience, patience, relentless drive. Without them, I might have quit when things got hard. Instead, I leaned in harder. Sitting at that Christmas dinner years later, listening to my father praise my brothers for their roles in the real family business, I kept this history close like a hidden blade. He thought I was still that girl with a hobby. He had no idea the girl he dismissed had grown into a woman leading one of the fastest rising companies in health technology. And here's where I turn it to you. Have you ever been told your work, your passion, your dream was not real? That it wasn't serious enough, valuable enough, practical enough? Drop a comment if you've lived through that kind of dismissal. Because the truth is, those so-called hobbies often become revolutions when we refuse to let them die. In that moment, I smiled politely as my brothers bragged about expanding manufacturing plants and quarterly profits. I let them talk. I let my father beam with pride, because I knew something they didn't, that I had built my own empire in silence, and soon that silence was going to be shattered. The more my company grew, the more surreal it became to return home for family gatherings. In Silicon Valley, I was the founder of health tech AI, pitching at conferences, closing contracts with hospitals, and leading a team that believed in me. At Christmas, I was still the daughter who, in my father's eyes, had chosen a toy over the family empire. That year, just before the dinner where everything would unfold, I had flown in straight from a meeting with a major healthcare network. We'd secured a multi-million-dollar deal, the kind of contract that would keep us afloat for years and cement our reputation in the industry. My team had celebrated with cheap champagne in paper cups. Me, I packed a suitcase and got on a flight back to the East Coast, bracing myself for another round of silence at the table. The pattern was familiar. My brothers sitting tall, my father pouring them whiskey, and long discussions about production schedules and profit margins. My name rarely came up. And when it did, it was usually framed as a cautionary tale. Your sister could have been running factories with you, but she chose computers. I never corrected them. Part of me wanted to. Another part thought, let them underestimate me. It's easier this way. But under the surface, the divide was widening. My brothers saw me as an outsider. My father saw me as a disappointment. And me, I saw a family clinging to an empire of steel and concrete, while I was building something intangible but infinitely scalable. Their factories could produce goods. My algorithms were saving lives. Yet somehow that didn't seem to count. One night after dinner, my brother pulled me aside. He smirked as he said, "You know Dad rewrote the will, right? It's all ours now. He says he can't risk the family fortune on, what did he call it? Your science experiment." I didn't flinch, but inside it cut deep. It wasn't about the money, I was already financially independent. It was about erasure. About the message that no matter what I accomplished, I would never be considered equal in his eyes. On the flight back to San Francisco, I stared out the window, replaying his words. And for the first time, I asked myself, why do I even care anymore? The answer came slowly somewhere over the Rockies. I cared because family is supposed to see you, to recognize you, to stand behind you even when the world doesn't. But my family had never done that. They had turned their backs when I was 18. They had dismissed me at 25. And now as I approached 30, they wanted to erase me entirely. That realization shifted something in me. I decided I wouldn't chase their approval anymore. I wouldn't measure myself against their factories or their profits. I had my own path, my own empire, my own definition of success. Still, I knew that one day the truth would come out, not through a confrontation, not through an argument, but through the simple weight of undeniable fact. And when it did, it would not just surprise them. It would devastate the illusion they had built about who I was. But before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever been cut out, overlooked, or underestimated by the very people who should have believed in you most? If so, I want you to share your story in the comments. Because here's the truth, when we tell those stories, we remind each other that invisibility is never permanent. One day, the world sees. One day, the truth speaks louder than the dismissal. The Christmas dinner that year had ended with my father raising a toast to the future of the family business, my brothers, smiling, wide glasses clinking. I sipped water quietly, smiling at my own secret, because I knew my real toast was still to come. By the time the next Christmas rolled around, the air around me felt different. My company had gone from surviving to scaling, from whispers in small hospitals to discussions with major research universities. Our technology wasn't just helping diagnose rare conditions. It was starting to predict them, offering doctors a roadmap before symptoms even appeared. That year, a respected medical journal had published a feature on our breakthroughs, and suddenly my inbox was flooded with invitations to conferences, podcasts, and collaborations. But none of that mattered to my family. When I stepped into my father's grand dining room that December, it was like walking into a frozen photograph. The table was long, the crystal glasses gleamed, and the conversations were the same as always, my brothers boasting about factory expansions, my father nodding with approval, the clink of silver against china. I sat in my usual seat, invisible, the guest at her own family's table. Yet inside, something had shifted. I was no longer the girl craving their validation. I had my own measure now, the child whose rare disease was diagnosed in time because of our system, the mother who wrote me a letter saying you saved my son, the doctors who told me we'd shortened years of trial and error into hours of clarity. These were the voices that mattered. Still, the weight of their dismissal lingered. Halfway through dinner, my father leaned back and said, "This year has proven the strength of our legacy. My sons are carrying it forward. Real work, real business." not like these digital distractions people keep hyping up. He didn't look at me, but everyone knew the jab was aimed my way. My brothers smirked into their wine. I lifted my glass, smiled faintly, and stayed silent. Because I had begun to understand something, silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. That night, in the guest room upstairs, I scrolled through an email that had just come in. It was from a major healthcare system in New York, confirming a deal worth tens of millions of dollars. The kind of deal that would make us not just sustainable, but unstoppable. I stared at the message in the glow of my phone, the laughter from downstairs echoing faintly through the walls. I realized then that my father's empire was locked in place, bound by factory supply chains and physical goods. Mine was fluid, invisible, expanding through servers and data centers carried by ideas instead of shipments. His was steel. Mine was air. And air once unleashed could move anywhere. The old me would have run downstairs with the email open, shoving it in their faces, demanding they see me. But the new me knew better. Recognition wasn't something you forced, it was something you let arrive on its own terms when the evidence became undeniable. And so I waited. I went back to San Francisco, threw myself into scaling the company, and built systems strong enough to stand without me watching every line of code. The press began calling me the quiet force in medical AI. Investors who had once ignored my pitches were now leaving voicemails begging for a meeting. The company had crossed into a new orbit. Yet still my family knew nothing. They were too busy expanding their factories, too secure in their assumption that I had amounted to nothing. They never Googled my name, never asked questions, never connected the dots. And that's when I began to see the irony. Their blindness wasn't just arrogance, it was a shield. They couldn't see me because they refused to look. And in that refusal, they gave me the gift of time to grow unchallenged, underestimated, and unnoticed until the reveal would be impossible to ignore. Have you ever held on to a secret like that? A truth so powerful that you knew when it finally surfaced, it would change everything. If you have, you understand the patience it takes to carry that silence, the fire it keeps alive inside you. That fire carried me forward, and though they still saw me as the daughter who didn't belong, I had already become the woman who would one day prove them all wrong. The following year, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in over a decade, my company's name wasn't just whispered in industry circles, it was printed in bold headlines on the front page of major newspapers. A groundbreaking partnership with the Mayo Clinic had been announced, solidifying us as the leader in predictive medical AI. Overnight, my inbox was swarmed with congratulations, my phone buzzing with calls from investors, reporters, and even government officials. I had always imagined what that moment would feel like. Would I scream? Would I finally rush to show my father? Instead, I sat quietly at my desk, the sunlight falling across the stacks of contracts, and just let the quiet satisfaction sink in. The validation I had craved for years was finally here, but it wasn't coming from my family. It was coming from the world. Still, I couldn't help but think about Christmas. I knew I'd be flying back, sitting once again at that long table, listening to the same conversations about steel and shipments. Part of me wondered, would they have seen the headlines, would they connect the dots? But another part knew the answer. My family didn't live in the world of algorithms and breakthroughs. They lived in the world of production quotas and balance sheets. To them, I was still the one who had walked away. Dinner was almost identical to every other year. My brothers bragged about expansion into new markets. My father lifted his glass to toast the strength of our family's legacy, and no one mentioned my name, not once. And yet something shifted inside me that night. I realized I wasn't the outsider anymore. I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I was the storm building just beyond their horizon. They couldn't see it yet, but they would. After dinner, while the others stayed behind for cigars, I stepped outside into the cold night air. Snow crunched under my boots as I looked up at the stars, my breath forming clouds in the dark. I thought about the patients whose lives had been saved that month because of our system. About the little girl in Texas who had been diagnosed early enough to receive life-saving treatment. About the letter from her mother that I kept folded in my wallet. That was my family now, the people who trusted me, the strangers whose lives intertwined with mine through data and diagnoses. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need my father's recognition anymore. His empire could continue without me. Mine was already rewriting the future. But the silence still weighed heavy. They had no idea what I had built, and in their ignorance they continued to dismiss me. What they didn't know was that the reveal was coming, and it wouldn't be subtle. Because the more we grew, the harder it became to stay invisible. Soon there would be magazine covers. Soon there would be keynote speeches. And soon, whether they wanted to or not, my family would have to reckon with the truth. The daughter they had erased had built something far greater than any factory they owned. And maybe you know what that feels like too, when you carry a truth so powerful, you can already see the day it will break open, even if everyone around you is still blind. That's the patience of people who are underestimated. That's the quiet fire of the overlooked. I returned to San Francisco after that holiday, with a strange calm. The erasure no longer cut as deep. The silence no longer stung. Because I finally understood it wasn't my job to force them to see me. It was their fate to one day realize they had never seen me at all, and that day was coming faster than any of us imagined. The breaking point arrived sooner than I expected. It was spring in New York, the air thick with that restless energy the city always carries, when I found myself standing backstage at a conference hall filled with thousands of doctors, investors, and journalists. The organizers had asked me to deliver the keynote address introducing our predictive AI platform to the world in its full scope for the first time. I could feel the heat of the lights even before stepping onto the stage, my heart hammering in my chest, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. For years, I had been invisible at my own family's table. Now I was about to become impossible to ignore. The screen behind me lit up with charts images of patients and statistics. I spoke of the little boy whose rare disease had been detected early, of the countless mothers and fathers who had written to me with gratitude, of the millions of dollars in costs saved by hospitals because we had shortened the diagnostic process from years to days. I told them about the algorithms, but more importantly, I told them about the lives those algorithms touched. The applause was thunderous. Reporters swarmed the stage afterward. Within hours, headlines exploded across every major outlet. The future of medicine is here. The woman who outsmarted disease. My name wasn't just in print, it was everywhere. And yet, as the interviews poured in, my thoughts drifted back to my family's Christmas table. Would they see this? Would they finally understand? But here's the twist: I didn't want them to see me anymore. At least not yet. For the first time, the thought of their ignorance gave me power. They still believed I was nothing, and that belief was a shield that let me move freely, quietly building an empire while they looked the other way. Still, I knew the reveal was inevitable. My name was no longer tucked away in obscure journals or whispered in hospital hallways. It was being broadcast on national television, trending online, quoted in financial reports. Whether they wanted to or not, my family was about to discover the truth. And when they did, it wouldn't just surprise them, it would shatter the entire narrative they had built about me. That realization gave me a surge of confidence I had never felt before. I was no longer playing defense. I was holding the biggest card in the deck, waiting for the right moment to lay it down. Think about that for a second. Have you ever carried a secret victory so massive you knew it would flip the entire story upside down once it came out? That's the place I was standing in. I left New York that week knowing the clock had started ticking. Every headline, every podcast, every award was another brick in the wall that would make my family's ignorance impossible to sustain. The silence at Christmas, the dismissive glances, the jokes at my expense. They were about to collide with a reality so undeniable, it would rewrite everything. And I'll be honest with you, part of me relished that thought. After years of being erased, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing the reckoning was close. But another part of me, a quieter part, wondered what would happen to me when that day finally came. Would I feel vindicated, or would the victory taste bitter, knowing I had wasted so many years craving the approval of people who never truly saw me? I didn't have the answer yet. All I knew was the next Christmas would not be like the others. Because by then, the truth would no longer be mine alone to carry. Christmas came faster than I imagined, but this year felt different even before I boarded the flight home. The entire world seemed to know my name. Just a week earlier, Time magazine had run a full feature calling me one of the top 25 innovators of the decade. My inbox overflowed with requests for interviews, partnerships, and keynote invitations. My face had been on television screens across the country. Yet stepping off the plane in Cleveland, walking into the snow-covered streets I had known since childhood, I felt the same weight settle on my shoulders. Would this holiday be any different? Would the silence finally break? Or would my family still look at me like the daughter who chose the wrong path? The annual Christmas dinner was almost scripted at this point, my father at the head of the table, my brothers on either side, glasses of bourbon and cigars waiting in the next room. The same oak-paneled dining room, the same polished silverware. Nothing had changed except me. But here's the thing, they hadn't said a word about my year. Not one mention of the headlines, the interviews, or the fact that my name was being spoken in rooms of power they could never access. It was as if they lived in a parallel universe where my achievements didn't exist. Until the doorbell rang. My father's butler opened the door, and in stepped a man in a crisp suit carrying a sleek black briefcase. He introduced himself as a representative from one of the largest hospital networks in the country. He was there because my father's company, his steel empire, was in the process of negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal with a medical conglomerate. What my family didn't know was that the deal hinged entirely on one thing: whether they could integrate my company's technology into their infrastructure. The room froze. All eyes turned to me. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like erasure. It felt like recognition hanging heavy in the air. My father's empire, the one he had built brick by brick, was suddenly tethered to mine. The representative looked directly at me and said, "We've been trying to reach you for months. Without your approval, this deal won't move forward." I wish I could describe my father's face in that moment. The man who had spent decades dismissing me, who had toasted to his legacy while ignoring my existence, suddenly saw the truth. And the truth was undeniable. His future rested in the hands of the daughter he had tried to erase. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and said, "We'll talk after dinner." Inside, though, I felt something shift. For years I had carried the wound of their silence, the sting of being unseen. But now the tables had turned. The power wasn't in their recognition, it was in my ability to decide what came next. And I'll be honest with you, part of me wanted to make them wait, to let them feel the same dismissal I had endured. But another part of me, stronger, calmer, realized I didn't need revenge. I already had victory. That night, as I looked around the table, I saw them differently. My father wasn't a giant anymore. My brothers weren't rivals. They were just men sitting in a room bound by their own blindness. And me, I was free. And maybe you've had a moment like that too, when the people who doubted you suddenly needed you. When the balance of power flipped and you realized you no longer had to chase their approval. You already held the upper hand. Dinner ended quietly. No one laughed as loudly as usual. No one bragged about shipments or markets. The air was thick with a new awareness, one they couldn't put into words. And for the first time in my life, I walked out of that house not as the forgotten daughter, but as the one who held the key to their future. I didn't sleep that night. The hotel suite downtown overlooked the frozen river, its surface glittering under streetlights like shattered glass. I stood at the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, replaying the scene at the dinner table over and over again. My father's silence, my brother's uneasy glances, the representative's words that cut through years of dismissal. "Without your approval, this deal won't move forward." For so long I had imagined vindication as loud as applause cheers or dramatic apologies. But what I felt instead was a quiet power heavier and more profound. It was the realization that I didn't need them anymore, and yet they needed me more than ever. The following morning, my father requested a private meeting. We sat across from each other in the lounge of the hotel, a fire crackling between us. He looked older than I remembered, the lines in his face deeper, his voice not quite as steady. He cleared his throat and said, "We should talk business." I almost laughed. Business. That was the one language he respected, the one battlefield where he felt untouchable. And now here he was, forced to acknowledge that the daughter he had once dismissed as irrelevant held a company more valuable than his entire empire. I listened as he explained the terms of the deal. His tone measured his pride, slipping through every word. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "Will you approve the integration?" And here's the moment where everything crystallized for me. I could have said yes immediately, and he would have owed me. I could have said no, and I would have crushed him. But instead I leaned back in my chair, let the silence stretch, and finally said, "I'll consider it, but not for you, for the hospitals, for the patients who will benefit. You're just incidental." The look on his face told me everything. He realized in that instant that he no longer defined me. I wasn't reacting to him or chasing him or rebelling against him. I had built a world of my own and he was now orbiting me. And that's when I understood something vital. True freedom isn't proving yourself to the people who doubted you. It's reaching the point where their doubt doesn't matter anymore. Still, the conversation ended unresolved. My father left the room without shaking my hand. He couldn't bring himself to admit defeat, not out loud. But I didn't need his words. The silence that had once been suffocating was now liberating. That afternoon, I took a long walk through the snowy streets, the city muffled and quiet. For years I had dreamed of this reckoning, imagined the dramatic confrontation, the apologies, the recognition. But life rarely gives you cinematic closure. What it gave me instead was far more powerful perspective. I realized that I didn't have to burn bridges or seek revenge. The real victory was in knowing I had built something enduring, something that would outlast the pettiness of one family dinner. My work wasn't just numbers or profit margins. It was saving lives, rewriting the rules of medicine, creating a future bigger than any of us. And maybe that's something you need to hear too. Your worth is not defined by the people who underestimate you. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't revenge at all, it's living in such a way that their opinions become irrelevant. That night I sat by the window again, but this time there was no replaying of scenes, no bitterness, no longing, only clarity. The next chapter of my life wasn't about my family anymore. It was about what I chose to build and who I chose to build it for, and that choice that freedom was mine alone. The days after that meeting blurred together, but in the best possible way. For once, I wasn't waking up with a knot of dread in my stomach, wondering how to brace myself against my family's judgment. Instead, I woke with a strange lightness, as if some invisible chain had finally snapped. But peace never comes without its tests. 2 days before New Year's Eve, I received an invitation hand-delivered by one of my brothers. It was to the annual gala my father hosted for the city's elite. Normally, I would have dismissed it outright. That event had always been a stage where my father displayed his dominance, where my brothers boasted about deals and acquisitions, and where I was treated like an afterthought in my own family's story. But this year was different, because this year every powerful person in that ballroom knew who I was. Not as my father's daughter, but as the CEO whose innovations were about to transform an industry. I stood in front of my mirror in the hotel suite, staring at the dress I had chosen, a deep emerald green gown, simple yet commanding. For years I had tried to blend in at those events, hoping invisibility would spare me from judgment. But now invisibility wasn't an option. The world saw me whether my family liked it or not. Walking into that ballroom was like stepping onto a battlefield I'd been avoiding for decades. The chandeliers sparkled, the air buzzed with expensive perfume and hushed deals. But as I moved through the crowd, something strange happened. People stopped me not to ask about my father, but to congratulate me, to thank me, to shake my hand. And for the first time, my father wasn't the center of gravity. I was. I caught him watching me from across the room, his glass of scotch trembling just slightly in his hand. My brothers tried to intercept the conversations to remind the guests of their own roles in the family empire, but it was useless. The narrative had shifted. Still, the real test came when a board member from the hospital group approached me directly and asked, "So, will you greenlight the deal?" Every head turned. The room fell into that eerie kind of silence, the kind that amplifies every breath, every heartbeat. And in that moment, I understood what power truly meant. It wasn't about crushing others or humiliating them or demanding recognition. Power was about choice. My choice. I smiled, let the suspense hang in the air, and finally said I'll make the decision in January, once my team has completed its due diligence. Patient safety comes first. It was subtle, but the effect was seismic. Because what I had really said was, I don't move on your timeline. You move on mine. The applause came quiet at first, then louder until the whole room was clapping. Not for my father, not for the empire he had built. For me. And here's the part I didn't expect standing there receiving that validation. I didn't feel triumphant in the way I imagined. I felt steady, grounded. As if life had finally caught up to the truth I had known all along. I didn't need their approval to shine. And maybe you've been in a similar place, on the verge of a room that once terrified you, only to realize it no longer holds the same power. The fear was an illusion, and the moment you step through, the whole room changes. That night, as I left the gala, I caught my reflection in the mirrored doors. And for the first time, I didn't see the girl who used to beg for her family's attention. I saw a woman who had claimed her own story, and I knew deep down that the real twist was still coming. I thought the gala would be the pinnacle, the moment I'd finally feel untouchable. But the universe has a way of testing us right when we least expect it. 2 mornings later, as snow blanketed the city, I received a call from a journalist I trusted. Her voice was urgent, almost apologetic. "They're trying to smear you," she said. "Your family's PR team is leaking stories that you mismanaged funds, that your rise was built on your father's resources, that you're not the visionary people think you are." For a moment, my chest tightened. Old fears stirred, the same voices that once told me I was nothing without them. But then, like a fire igniting in the cold clarity, returned. I wasn't that scared, invisible girl anymore, and I wasn't alone. Within hours, my inbox filled with messages from hospital directors, patient advocacy groups, and even strangers who had read about our innovations. They weren't asking if the rumors were true, they were offering support. One note read, "My daughter is alive because of your work. Don't let them take this away from you." That was when it hit me my story had outgrown the small theater of family politics. This wasn't about sibling rivalries or an empire's succession plan anymore. It was about real lives, real people. And no smear campaign could erase that. Still, I knew I couldn't stay silent. Silence was what had kept me powerless for years. So that night, I agreed to an interview on national television. The studio lights were blinding the cameras, unforgiving, but my voice was steady. I looked straight into the lens and said, "For years I believed I wasn't enough, that because I wasn't invited to the table, I had no right to speak. But here's the truth, you don't need permission to make a difference. You just need the courage to start. My work isn't about revenge or recognition. It's about saving lives. And if that threatens people who built their empires on control, so be it." The anchor asked, "Do you deny that your success is tied to your family's name?" I smiled. My family's name closed doors for me more often than it opened them. Everything I've built by refusing to let those doors define me. The interview went viral overnight. Social media lit up with support patients sharing stories, doctors praising our breakthroughs. Even critics had to admit the results spoke louder than gossip. And then something unexpected happened. People began sharing their own stories of being dismissed, underestimated, erased by those in power. It became bigger than me. It became a movement. And this is where I need to pause and ask you, how many times have you let someone else's version of you dictate your worth? How many opportunities have you abandoned because of voices that said you didn't belong? If this resonates, tell me in the comments, because your story might be the reminder someone else needs. As I lay in bed that night, my phone buzzing with endless notifications, I realized the smear campaign had backfired. In trying to silence me, my family had amplified me, but deep down I knew this wasn't the end. Power never concedes without a fight, and my father wasn't the kind of man to retreat quietly. The real reckoning was still ahead, and strangely, I was ready for it. When the smear campaign collapsed under its own weight, I thought maybe, just maybe, my father would finally relent. But men like him don't surrender. They regroup. They plot. The storm came a week later. I was preparing for a board meeting when my attorney called, her tone clipped and tense. "Your father has filed an injunction," she said. "He's demanding full access to your company's records, claiming his initial investments entitle him to control." For a moment, I went still. It wasn't about money. It was about dominance. He couldn't stand that the child he once dismissed now commanded more influence than him. And so he was dragging the fight into the courts, hoping the weight of legal warfare would crush me. Walking into that courtroom was like stepping into a theater of ghosts. My brothers sat behind my father, their eyes glinting with the cruel satisfaction of children who think their bully will always win. My father himself looked carved from stone, stoic, immovable. But this time I wasn't alone. My team of advisors, partners, and supporters filled the benches behind me. Doctors in white coats, patients who had benefited from our innovations, even advocacy leaders who had flown in on their own dime just to show solidarity. When my father's lawyer stood and painted me as reckless, dependent, unfit to lead, I didn't flinch. And when it was my turn to take the stand, I didn't plead. I told the truth. I spoke of the nights I spent in labs, while my family dined in luxury, of the grants I secured with nothing but persistence, of the breakthroughs that saved children's lives, not with my father's money, but in spite of it. The judge listened carefully. At one point, she interrupted my father's lawyer with a pointed question. If her leadership is so flawed, why is her company's success recognized globally? The silence that followed was delicious. But the most unexpected moment came when a patient's father, a man whose daughter's life had been saved through our work, stood in the gallery and shouted, "She saved my child. She doesn't owe you anything." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff tried to quiet him, but the damage was done. Truth had slipped past the walls of formality. And in that instant, I realized something profound. My father could battle me in boardrooms and courtrooms, but he couldn't erase the living proof of my impact. The judge didn't issue an immediate ruling, but I saw the writing on the wall. The tide had turned. Leaving the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward me. For once, I didn't shrink. I raised my head high and said, "This fight was never about money or control. It's about the right to define yourself. And I refuse to surrender that to anyone, even family." The clip aired across every major network. Strangers stopped me on the street, not out of pity, but out of admiration. They saw me not as a victim of a family feud, but as a symbol of resilience. Still, even as the world applauded, I knew the battle wasn't truly over. My father had lost ground, but men like him never retreat quietly. They wait, they calculate, and they strike again when you least expect it. And so, as I closed my hotel door that evening, exhaustion washing over me, I whispered to myself, "This isn't the end. The real twist hasn't revealed itself yet." Because deep down, I could feel it. The final reckoning was already on its way. The final Christmas arrived with a strange sense of anticipation, almost electric in its intensity. I was flying back to Cleveland, not just for the holidays, but for the ultimate confrontation, the last act of a drama that had been brewing for over a decade. My company was no longer a secret. Health tech AI had grown into a global powerhouse, recognized not only for innovation, but for the lives it saved. Every article, every media feature, every patient story made my father's empire seem small in comparison, though he wouldn't admit it. The snow was falling gently as I pulled up to the house, the same colonial structure that had been my stage for so many silent humiliations. But this time I wasn't the timid girl in borrowed clothes. I stepped out of my own car, wrapped in a warm coat, exuding confidence I had earned the hard way. The house, adorned in twinkling lights, looked the same as I remembered, yet the stakes felt entirely different. I could sense it. The family would never see this Christmas the same way again. Inside, the familiar faces awaited. My brothers Ryan and Daniel exchanged glances that were more cautious than celebratory this time. My father Richard Donovan sat at the head of the table, a glass of scotch in hand, his expression unreadable. But even in his careful composure, there was a flicker of something I had never seen before, curiosity, maybe even respect, or perhaps the first sign of fear. The dinner began with the usual pleasantries, but the energy was taut. Every comment, every smile, every gesture was measured. It was clear that everyone sensed the invisible shift, the quiet tension of waiting for the storm to reveal itself. I kept my composure, sipping water, listening to the familiar discussions about the family business. And then it happened. A small voice from the youngest generation, my niece Emma, spoke up. "Aunt Claire, is it true?" She held a tablet showing the latest Forbes update. Forbes billionaires list, Claire Donovan, $3.2 billion. The room froze. Even my father's hand paused midair. I let the silence linger, giving the truth the weight it deserved. "Yes," I said simply. "Health tech AI was acquired last month. That's my worth." It was as if the room had shifted on its axis. My father's face drained of color, his carefully maintained composure unraveling. Ryan and Daniel looked like children caught sneaking candy, unsure whether to gloat, be proud, or hide. Even my mother Elaine was speechless, tears welling in her eyes, recognizing for the first time what I had built on my own. I told them calmly about the early years, how I lived in a tiny apartment, poured everything back into the company, and spent nights wondering if I'd ever survive. I spoke of the breakthrough that changed everything, the algorithm that correctly diagnosed rare conditions, saving lives that would have otherwise been lost. And I made it clear none of it was built on inheritance, none of it owed to them. The effect was instantaneous. The pride, envy, astonishment all collided in a single tangible wave. Ryan tried to offer the usual business-minded remark, but it fell flat. Daniel, for once, wasn't sure what to say. And my father just looked at me, the gravity of his decades of dismissals finally colliding with reality. After a long pause, he spoke slowly, carefully, almost unfamiliar to me. "Claire, I am sorry. I didn't see your potential. I didn't understand. You deserved better. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to erase years of neglect. But it was sincere. And that sincerity finally was enough to open a door that had been closed for far too long. I smiled gently. Thank you, Dad. That's all I ever wanted. The rest of the evening unfolded differently. My brothers asked questions not to challenge, but to understand. My niece and nephew were fascinated by the technology, asking how it worked and what they could do to learn more. My mother whispered that she had always believed in me, silently keeping clippings and articles in a folder I had never seen. We laughed. We shared. And for the first time, the family felt like more than just a hierarchy of expectation. It felt like a team. And here's the final thought for you. Sometimes your worth won't be recognized by those closest to you. Sometimes you'll need to carve your own path, build your own legacy, and wait for the moment the world acknowledges it. But when it comes, it's not just about victory, it's about freedom, respect, and the ability to redefine relationships on your own terms. So if this story resonates, take a moment to reflect who in your life underestimates you. Where are you waiting for recognition that may never come? And remember, sometimes the most powerful triumph is the one you achieve without anyone's permission. The holidays ended, but the lessons lingered. Driving away from the house that night, snow crunching under my tires, I realized something fundamental: wealth and recognition, while powerful, are secondary to the truth of who you are and the life you've built on your own terms. I had finally stepped out of the shadow of my family's expectations and into the light of my own achievements. In the days and months that followed, our company continued to grow, but the real growth was personal. I learned to measure success not by the approval of others, but by impact. The number of lives changed, the opportunities created, the boundaries expanded. My father slowly but genuinely began to engage with me, not as the daughter he once dismissed, but as a partner in progress, someone whose insights mattered beyond financial gain. My brothers, too, adjusted, learning that admiration is earned, not assumed, and that supporting someone else's brilliance doesn't diminish your own. That year, I returned again for Christmas. This time, there was no tension, no unspoken competitions, no dismissive comments. The table was filled with conversation about technology, innovation, and personal growth as much as family and tradition. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and for the first time I felt truly seen, not for what I had inherited, but for what I had created. And in that quiet joy, I realized the most valuable lessons: resilience can build empires, patience can transform relationships, and the courage to define your own path can rewrite the story you thought was set in stone. Life doesn't always grant acknowledgement when we want it, but it does reward perseverance, integrity, and authenticity. So if you're watching this and have struggled to be recognized, know this: your worth isn't determined by those who overlook you. Keep building, keep believing. And when the world finally sees you, let it be on your terms, in your own power. Because true fulfillment comes not from approval, but from creating a life that aligns with your deepest values and making a difference that only you can make. That night, as the family gathered around for photos, I looked at each face, my own team, and the generations to come, and felt a profound contentment. Success had opened doors, but it was love, understanding, and honest connection that had made them meaningful. And that, I realized, was the true legacy worth celebrating.